Well, today I would like to talk about something that is also kind of a long time in coming, but that is very contemporary as well. I've titled my talk, "Is this the end of the globalism we know?" And as I will explain in a moment, there is a very specific reason for using the term globalism instead of globalization. As you're all aware of, with the COVID-19 pandemic, political economies across the globe are seeing massive changes, and many analysts, pundits, journalists, people in academia and beyond are predicting that what we're seeing is a prolonged period of de-globalization or even economic decoupling, especially between the United States and China, but perhaps even beyond that. And all of this indeed seems to be coming true. However, when we talk about the term deglobalization, or even more poignantly, decoupling, I feel it glosses over some very important complexities and distinctions, and actually ultimately these two terms miss the point. So I started to use the term globalism. What do I mean with globalism? This term is used here for a very specific and distinct reason. It conceptualizes the ideas, processes, rules, and norms underlying a specific global order. So in many ways, globalism expresses the ideas, institutions, and ultimately interests that shape a particular global system during a particular historical period. Globalization, on the other hand, is actually a process. It is a process that denotes, quite simply, increased integration, especially economic integration. In the contemporary era, which started roughly back in the 1980s under Reagan and Thatcher, both in the United States and the United Kingdom, this period has been marked by a process of ever freer trade, ever freer flows of capital, and ever more increased exchanges among peoples, governments, and corporations across the planet. So, as its opposite, deglobalization implies a unidirectional process of disintegration, a consistent fraying of global ties where ultimately we go back into the cocoon of the nation state. Decoupling goes even further. It basically implies the total severing of economic and potentially social, political, and cultural ties, either between certain countries or indeed even throughout the entire globe. So if every single economy and country across the globe decoupled, we would not be trading at all. We would not be traveling at all. Now, there's little doubt that in this present era, we're indeed witnessing a renewed emphasis on the nation state. Trump's America First policies expressed this very clearly, but it is common throughout all of the populist movements we are seeing, both in advanced and developing economies. These populist movements advocate that we should be cutting international ties, and specifically, we should be curtailing international migration. That often is the main policy platform, both in Europe and the United States, but it goes beyond that. Now, you add on to these populist movements that have been ongoing for at least the last 5, even longer, 10 years. You add on to this the pandemic caused by COVID-19, and it is purely accelerating, accentuating already ongoing dynamics. So basically, people who wanted to decouple and wanted to deglobalize, for them, COVID-19 is a very welcome additive. It is something that is accelerating these processes and is diminishing global integration and people-to-people exchanges. And there is no doubt that tourism, international tourism, as well as business travel will be taking a long-term hit and probably not recovering for something like 2 to probably even 5 years. 2 years is being very optimistic. However, if you look at the world at present, we also see some very strong converging pressures that emanate from the established processes of globalization and the institutions, interests, and ideas that the present globalism has established. In particular, the pull of global markets and corporate power remain intact. So the process of deglobalization, although occurring, is likely to be highly uneven and not complete. We will see some areas where we get deglobalization and some areas where globalization proceeds apace. So what we're witnessing is not really deglobalization per se. As I said, I feel this is a misnomer. This is a term that causes more misunderstanding than actually helps us understand. Rather, what we're seeing is that the unique arrangements of the globalism we have seen over the past 40 years are coming to an end. This globalism was based on, most importantly, neoliberal economics, but also the US-led international order that was established after World War II. So in the terms of international institutions, we're still very much in a Bretton Woods era. The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, also the United Nations, and so on. But what was new to this globalism since roughly the 1980s has been neoliberal economics. And I will come back to this, indeed, what I would call a contradiction, a dissonance between these two, the liberal international order and neoliberal economics, in a moment. So how will I proceed? In the following, I would like to do basically four things. First, I would like to provide you with a bit of a kind of conceptual background. I will briefly delve into the history of globalism. Then I will basically expound on the end of the globalism as we know, especially the reasons for that. In the third part, I will look at COVID-19 and the fraying of US-China relations and how they are affecting different aspects of globalization and how this de-globalization or even decoupling is likely to be very uneven, and indeed decoupling is not likely at all. And finally, I will provide a few thoughts on what the future might hold, especially the next decade, the 2020s. So a brief history of globalism. I don't want to bore you too much with history, but in this context, it's indeed very important. Globalism began with mercantilism, roughly back at the end of the 15th century. Often the modern era is designated as beginning when Christopher Columbus discovered the Americas. But in my opinion, actually began with the first experiments in capitalism by the Italian city-states. The Medici in Florence, for example, invented modern banking and the bond market. Mercantilism can be divided into roughly three periods. I call them A, B, C. The first period was the Portuguese and the Spaniards. The second period was the Dutch, who developed the first corporation, the Dutch East India Corporation. And period C was the first era of British global dominance back in the 18th century, but still characterized by mercantilism, a system that combined private corporate power with state power in the pursuit of both profit and the maximization of state power. At the time, state power was seen as being maximized by hoarding as much gold as you could, but as the Spaniards found out a bit too late, it didn't really work. So come the first era of free trade, the golden era, beginning roughly around 1850, but the ideas for it were actually expounded upon by Adam Smith and David Ricardo at the end of the 18th and the early 19th century. This system combined free trade, the gold standard, the free movement of people. We often forget that. Migration was actually much more open during this period, albeit it was mainly for Europeans. And the free movement of capital for the first time in the history of the globe. This era brought unprecedented prosperity and developmental opportunities, in particular for the United States, but also other parts of Europe, such as Germany and Latin America. This system fell apart with World War I, and we entered the interwar period, which actually has some very interesting parallels to our present era. I don't want to overplay these parallels. We are in the 2020s. That was the 1920s. We're exactly 100 years apart. But there are also some distinct differences, especially in terms of its geopolitics, because the interwar period saw efforts by the United Kingdom to reestablish the golden era, but the United Kingdom lacked the geopolitical and economic heft. The United States, at that point already by far the most powerful economy on earth, was unwilling to participate strongly and therefore this period never really came to full fruition. British ideas and intents of reestablishing the golden era never were successful. Everything fell apart in the 1930s. I dearly hope we do not have to face this history again. And then was reestablished after World War II with the Bretton Woods era, what many of us international political economists term the era of embedded liberalism. A form of liberalism, but that was highly constrained, especially capital flows were constrained, and so was migration, and indeed even parts of trade. This era again came to an end in the 1970s as the United States faced unprecedented economic problems at that point. Since the Great Depression, those were the most intense economic problems the United States had faced, and basically abandoned the gold standard, and then gradually in the 1980s established a new form of globalism based on neoliberal economics. The idea that free markets know best, and the state, at best, keeps out of things, indeed, even is weakened to the extent that it is ineffectual. This has been an extreme form of looking at neoliberal economics, but it is very well represented by libertarians in the United States, the Tea Party movement following the financial crisis, and now even aspects of Trump's policies. The idea that free markets know best is quite powerful, but in reality, this era of neoliberalism became corporate neoliberalism. It was not so much that markets were freed, but that corporations gained unprecedented power, especially in the technology realm. So I foreshadowed a bit why I think this era is coming to an end, but let me be a bit more precise. The collapse of neoliberal globalism can be traced back to two factors. One is external, and the other one is internal. I personally feel that the internal dynamics, as a political economist, I do very much look at the internal dynamics of political economies. I feel that these actually are more important than the external dynamics, but a lot of literature, a lot of commentary has been written on the external dynamics. Simply put, it is the rise of the rest, especially China, but also Southeast Asia, India, and the resurgent Russia that has become basically rogue actor without modern parallel. A Foreign Affairs article that has just recently appeared about a week ago, I think, How Hegemony Ends, the Unraveling of American Power, by Alexander Cooley and Daniel Nixon, basically expresses this very well. How a shift in the balance of power has meant the United States is increasingly constrained and in a less dominant position. And therefore, the globalism that the United States has been leading for the last 30 years is coming to an end. So as I was talking about, I feel the internal dynamics, the increases in inequalities, the fraying of social safety nets are kind of a more important factor leading to the decline of the present era of globalism. And indeed, many societies in the last 30, 40 years, all of a sudden had to confront the other. In the United States, there's been actually unprecedented inward migration during this period. The only other period where we've had that much was actually back in the early 1900s, and then also the 1920s a bit. In Europe, there's been very strong migration. All of this has basically created a big populist backlash. The rise of the right, and especially the far right. In the United States, this has given Donald Trump an opening that he cleverly exploited to become president. Now, one thing that's very interesting and that we often forget is that there are actually three strands of political economy. One of them is liberal markets. The other one is social democracy, and often these two are seen as the main competing ideologies, especially here in the United States. We still kind of frame our political partisan competition between a free market Republican Party and a more social Democratic Party. However, there's a third strand that goes all the way back to Alexander Hamilton and Friedrich List. It is actually termed American political economy because the United States was the first country that effectively adopted it. And it basically emphasizes the establishment of national production systems. It is often termed also a form of neo-mercantilism. And certainly both Japan in the Meiji era and then again in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, as well as present-day China, have been followers of this national production system, or what I would call state developmentalist political economy. And Trump, in some very interesting ways, has been adapting and taking from this strand of political economy, but the implementation hasn't been very effective, and indeed half-real. American industrial policy, unfortunately, remains, for the most part, except in the defense sector, flagrantly incompetent. And that, I think, is one of the big problems that we are facing. But to the present, COVID-19 and deglobalization. As I mentioned, yes, in certain areas, we are facing a trend of deglobalization, people-to-people exchanges, international tourism, business travel, indeed meetings, conferences. These areas of the economy are likely to see a prolonged downturn. Even maybe business integration could see a prolonged downturn as people cannot travel so much anymore. Mergers and acquisitions, cross-listings, etc., seem to be more difficult, but we haven't really seen so much a downturn. Time will tell. Now, I have two examples that I want to basically look at to explain how deglobalization is occurring and how it is not occurring. And the first is what a lot of people have been talking about, and that is international global supply chains. These supply chains have become increasingly global. China has emerged as a central node for global manufacturing. And these supply chains have become also very efficient over time. One of the most important inventions over the past 40 years has been the container ship that allows goods to be transported at much greater ease and with much greater modality, meaning much easier transportation both on ships, but also trucks and trains than ever before. The new model is we move from efficiency to resilience. Our supply chains don't only have to be efficient, or indeed we can give up a bit of efficiency for greater resilience. But resilience does not actually require greater diversification. Indeed, it does not necessarily require reshoring, meaning coming back for American companies to US shores. Rather, what it means is greater diversification. And this might not necessarily mean that we're decoupling from China. Indeed, China has seen some very impressive trade figures for July. This might be a bit of a blip having to do with pent-up demand in the West, especially Europe and the US, as both have reopened again. But Chinese exports in July were the second highest on record. Only December was higher, and actually December figures always tend to be the highest each year. So China, in my opinion, is likely actually to remain a central node in global production systems. Even after 2 years plus of the trade war, much of the stuff that Americans are buying comes from China. And China is moving up the value-added ladder. So that means that a lot of lower value-added stuff, as we look at, for example, textiles and apparel, are shifting out of China. They're shifting to places like Vietnam, Cambodia, Bangladesh, India, and so on. But the case of textiles is quite interesting, and apparel, because a lot of the key ingredients in our clothes, such as the buttons, the zippers, even some of actually the textiles themselves are continuing to be made in China. So supply chain diversification does not per se imply a decoupling from China. It means that companies might have multiple manufacturing sites throughout the globe that they can rely on. It also might mean that they're keeping more goods in storage to basically forestall supply chain difficulties. But in many areas, and just anecdotally, everything I've been buying recently, except for food and apparel, most of these things ranging from electronics to shelves, furniture, etc., most of it remains made in China. So I personally don't see supply chains either reshoring or disintegrating. They're diversifying. They're actually becoming even more global. And in that sense, globalization is continuing to run apace in this area. Not every single product category, but most. Another area that a lot of people have been pointing to with deglobalization is the internet itself. The term splinternet has gained currency, and I believe that this is indeed more of a possibility. But the verdict is still out. Trump's war on Chinese technology corporations certainly could result in China being hemmed in. It already is in terms of the internet, let's be honest. China believes in a very different view of the role of the internet. It is sovereign, it is controlled by sovereign states, and there are clear borders, or in the Chinese case, it's a firewall. Whereas the United States has been proposing a global and free internet. The irony of Trump's war, especially his banning or his potential banning of TikTok and WeChat, is that he is actually following the Chinese view of the internet. Only American companies can own major social media apps in the United States. Needless to say, this could cause some very dire unintended consequences for American social media companies. Because other areas, such as the European Union, and we know the European Union has been having a difficult relationship with the likes of Google, Microsoft, and Amazon. If the European Union all of a sudden decides that Trump's policy makes sense, and that American companies cannot operate in the European Union, and rather will have to sell their enterprises, I know this is a far-fetched scenario, but this would be truly a catastrophe for American tech companies. So we'll see where this all ends up. Some final thoughts. The 2020s are likely to witness the end of neoliberal economics paired with the US-led liberal international order, what I call neoliberal globalism. In its place, I see a chaotic mélange emerging, where parts of the US-led liberal international order stay intact, and other parts are increasingly contested, where parts of globalization continue apace, and other areas indeed see deglobalization an increased frame. The nation state will become more important. State capitalism will become a very important form of governing economies. The Chinese are basically the second largest economy on earth. Is in some sense, I don't like the term state capitalist because there's a very large private sector that is very vibrant and important in China. But yes, in China, the nation state stands there first and foremost. Corporations are somewhat in a secondary position, and state governance, especially industrial policy by the Chinese, is extremely important in driving development. This is being adopted not only in other developing economies, but even in advanced industrial economies. And I already pointed to, in some sense, what Trump is doing is taking a page out of the Chinese playbook and applying it to the United States. Unfortunately, he's doing it only halfway on the basically in the control of international flows of information and goods and services and capital, and not on the internal side, where a strong sense of effective industrial policy could help the United States stay the most competitive economy on earth. But as I mentioned, the United States has not been doing industrial policy broadly very well. This era of the 2020s that I call the chaotic mélange is likely to be quite contradictory and wobbly. It's a transitional era. That is the parallel to the 1920s, an era where we will not have one dominant power, indeed where dominant powers, not just the United States, but also China, are likely actually to retreat inward and be less interested in seeking global institutional solutions to the problems we face. And we will also have the remnants of the liberal order that will remain in place. So the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the United Nations, even the WTO and the WHO, in my opinion, are going nowhere. They are here. They will remain here regardless of the policies of individual nation states. But their effectiveness as global institutions in solving global problems will likely diminish. As I mentioned, state capitalist practices emphasizing techno-nationalism and national security will interact with these remnants of the liberal order. There will be a pull and a tug. There will be a constant back and forth between these neo-mercantilist inclinations of nation states and the continued power and attractions of global markets and capital. Perhaps the big winner in this chaotic mélange is neither China nor the United States. It is not a nation state, but maybe large corporations that can play both sides very well, using the continued integration of the global marketplace to become ever bigger, and using the neo-mercantilist, the techno-nationalist policies of nation states to further enrich themselves and strengthen their domestic monopolies. And this, again, can be especially the case in technology, as you have companies that are gaining such massive data and increasingly AI capacities that they rival nation states in their power and reach. So with this, I will end. As I mentioned, I do indeed see this as the end of the globalism we know, but it's not going to be a globalism sponsored by another dominant nation state, rather a chaotic mélange that is going to be quite dysfunctional, quite dangerous, and also quite chaotic. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for that. We do want to go to questions now. And I see that please use the Q&A tab for your questions. But I see something from Denny Roy. Thanks, Chris, for your presentation. You argued that US banning Chinese social media platforms might lead to Europeans banning US social media platforms. But this, I think, overlooks the national security rationale that is prominent in the US decision, even if you think it's a smokescreen. This would be absent in US-Europe economic relations. So would you comment on that?
So I used the example of Europe banning the likes of Google, Microsoft, Facebook, and Amazon in the European Union, or basically doing what the Trump administration is doing, which is saying TikTok can continue operating as long as it's an American company. So basically ByteDance, the Chinese owner of TikTok International, is forced to sell the American operations. And in this case, I think the various media reports indicate that it might not just be the US, but also Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. I don't think the United Kingdom is in there. But I use this as a hypothetical. The Europeans have been basically, trying to constrain the power of Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, etc., in the European Union with anti-monopoly policies. So they feel these are monopolies that need to be either hemmed in or broken up. All I'm arguing is that Trump has opened up the door for anyone to claim that the ownership of a social media platform or a very important, systemically important corporation, such as Amazon or Microsoft, is a national security threat. And this is basically the way the Chinese operate. So in many ways, if Trump would have framed his banning of TikTok and WeChat in terms of reciprocity, so China does not allow Google, does not allow Facebook to operate in China, therefore we will not allow your social media apps to operate in the United States, I feel this is a much stronger and much more convincing argument to be made than the national security. Although those concerns are not totally unjustified. So I don't think it's a total smokescreen, especially concerning WeChat, actually more so than TikTok. But coming back to what I'm saying is, what the Trump administration is doing by banning these apps is opening the door to any other power. The larger, the more important you are, the easier, because then you are less liable to be sanctioned, or the sanctions are less liable to be effective if the United States would decide to do so. But it opens the door basically to a sovereign governance of the internet. Basically what the Chinese have been advocating is systemically important companies on the internet, especially social media applications, are only allowed to function in your country if they're owned by domestic interests. And that actually, you can argue makes sense to some extent. It runs totally counter to the policies the United States has been advocating for a global and free and open internet. And it runs totally counter to the interests, the corporate and economic interests of the United States, because besides the Chinese, American companies are globally dominant. So actually the Chinese are only dominant in China itself and somewhat in Southeast Asia. And now that India is banning a lot of Chinese applications, that market is gone for them as well. So, and India is going to be a very interesting example. They banned the Chinese basically because of, well, national security grounds, but also because of what happened up in the Himalayas, a sort of kind of a tit for tat move against the Chinese, retaliation. But this is another country that could very easily decide, oh, we do not want anything here that is owned by outside interests. For American companies that also own substantial interests in the Indian social media market, this also could be very negative. So I use it as a hypothetical in just trying to say that these policies could have unintended consequences and ultimately backfire on American interests.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. Next week, Gerald Samita, Jerry, in this evolving context, where does a global pervasive phenomenon like climate change fit? What implications will it have on this new international environment? Thank you, Jerry, for your question. Yeah, Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Jerry. This actually has been one of the things that has been on the back of my mind with talking about a chaotic mélange, because not only climate change, but a lot of international problems will fail to be solved. We will not have effective international leadership. This could change. It could change with the new administration in the United States, but it would be increasingly difficult. One, because we have a different, the United States is not as dominant anymore in terms of its geopolitical sway. And second, we have incredible fraying of the domestic political consensus on what is the right thing to do or not. And the United States in particular expresses this, that we do not have a domestic consensus on how to deal with climate change. Indeed, we don't even really have a domestic consensus on whether climate change is a real problem or not, although recent surveys indicate that it's moving in the right direction, meaning more and more Americans do think that climate change is a real thing and is affecting our climate. Probably that's because the climate is increasingly becoming more chaotic and more weird. So I feel a certain degree of trepidation in the sense that global society is facing big problems. The pandemic is one of them. Climate change is another one. Migration, international migration and development, poverty is another very big one, because that ties right into the problems of climate change. And all of these problems seem to be kind of increasingly difficult to solve as we emphasize the nation state more and more. And as we indeed, compete in this sort of neo-mercantilist geopolitical fashion with each other, about who calls the shots, it'll be more and more difficult to come to agreement on solving these problems. Now, maybe to kind of insert an optimistic note, one of the things that has been happening with the pandemic, and indeed also since Donald Trump came to power in the United States, is a strengthening of the European Union. Maybe this will be seen as one of his great foreign policy accomplishments, unintended, but it might be indeed seen as such historically. Brexit played a very important role there as well. With the Brits gone, it's much easier for the French and the Germans to come to an agreement, and everybody else then has to fall in place. And the European Union is the foremost pusher of global climate change agreements, and itself has been as an economic bloc, the most advanced in trying to tackle climate change, though the Chinese are not far behind, especially technologically. Although if you look at what the Chinese are doing in terms of building more coal power plants and not taking them out of service, they're actually far behind the Europeans. So again, it's a mixed picture, but Europe stands there as kind of a bit as a glimmer of hope. And perhaps with the new American administration, the dynamics could change very rapidly. But again, I want to be optimistic, but it's difficult to be so. Thanks, Jerry. Great question.
And next, Richard Volstek from President of the East-West Center has a question. With the rise of power and pervasiveness of major social media platforms, do you envision more vigorous government attempts at regulatory antitrust actions in the US or Europe? Thank you.
Yes, yes, I do. But this is a difficult one. One cannot put the genie back in the box. These companies have become so powerful that it will be very difficult to rein them in. Unless, again, coming back to Denny's question, you know, other countries say, okay, or economic blocs such as the EU say, we will follow Trump's example, and we will require all major social media platforms, all major internet platforms in our jurisdiction to be owned by domestic interests. So that clearly would, you know, and as I said, this would be a catastrophe for the FANGs, for Facebook in particular, but also Amazon and Google. I don't think it's going to come to that, especially because these companies are so systemically important. They're so powerful, but more regulation, more attentive regulation, for sure. More effective regulation, we need to see. Again, thanks, Richard. This is a very interesting question. I know I've kind of punted it. I haven't really answered it because I really don't know the answer to it. Because you have the basics of this chaotic melange is perfectly expressed in this tug of war between these very large corporations and the nation state.
Thank you, Chris. Deborah Sipe asks, thank you for your presentation. Given your prediction of a chaotic melange in the near future, what are the implications for global cooperation around dealing with climate change? Basically, sort of the same. Did you already sort of answer that a little bit different than what Jerry asked?
Yeah, it's look at, again, you know, to just reiterate the glimmer of hope, because I don't want to be here and, you know, being a Cassandra. I unfortunately have been looking at COVID-19, as we all have over the past 6 months. Kind of saw this coming, especially in our state, you know, but so I want to kind of insert a degree of optimism, given the very difficult and somewhat dark times we are facing. And if there is a change in administration, I do see that the dynamic could change, especially in terms of international agreements, the Paris Climate Accord. But how much this will do to actually solve the problems of climate change, I am still somewhat pessimistic, for the simple reason that the easiest means and the most effective means to deal with climate change is a carbon tax. And every single government that tried to implement it has failed. And Australia is the most beautiful example. They actually did it. They had a carbon tax and it got rolled back with an election because the opposition was running on rolling it back. So, and while China is developing key technologies of the future, they are not really doing that much for climate change at present. As I mentioned, they're still building coal-fired power plants, not just in China, they're also building them globally in many developing countries, such as Pakistan. And they are starting to put in place somewhat like a carbon tax, a cap and trade system. So they're moving in the right direction. But at present, they're still a major, massive polluter, as is the United States. So we'll see what happens. But international agreements are good and fine. But I would like to see a lot more real action by national governments. And so far, I haven't really seen enough.
Thank you. We have an anonymous question. What impact will the deglobalizing changes you forecast have on the expanded investments, loans, and development projects that nations like China and the US have made in recent years?
Thank you. This is a great question because it allows me to once more give an example of how this is not a period of pure and simple deglobalization. And it's certainly not a period of decoupling. I perhaps haven't said enough about this, but if we push decoupling between the United States and China, just these two major economic norms, to an extreme, I mean, we really push decoupling, the economic consequences are going to be extremely dire. I mean, this is the end of Walmart. I sometimes go through Walmart and just look at where stuff is made, and anything in the kitchen section, in the furniture section, in the small electronics section, in the anything in the kind of non-food perishable medicine section is still made in China, and China's dominance in PPEs has even risen. So, you know, protective personal equipment, everything from face masks, etc. You know, I always love it. Designed in the USA, yeah, but where is it made? So, coming back to finance, the interesting thing is, my good old colleague Satu, who I think is not here, he mentioned that in one of the former webinars by the East-West Center, recent research shows that actually financial flows remain very strong. So in finance, we have not seen deglobalization. And the same thing in development finance, where actually the United States, China, and also the European Union, quite powerfully, are starting to compete with each other for, you know, providing development finance in Africa, in South Asia, in West Asia, in Central Asia, etc., where the Russians, by the way, play an important role too. So it doesn't look like financial flows, and especially development finance, are going to collapse. Maybe COVID-19 is going to be putting a crimp in this for a year or two, but the indications don't look like deglobalization there at all. It actually looks like increased competition, increased flows of development finance, but with a much more kind of neo-mercantilist, nationalist implication. It's much more, I'm giving you money and I want your favor, or I want something in return for this. This is not just for the good of your people, if it ever was. There's always been debates about, you know, whom does development finance really help, but there's going to be a lot more of this kind of neo-mercantilist geopolitical jockeying going on. And I do see at least three major actors. So I do see the European Union itself becoming a much more independent and powerful actor, China, the United States, and then we have kind of Russia and India as well, and Japan playing kind of more minor roles, but also participating in what you might call, you know, the new great game. And again, so it's a chaotic mélange. It's not pure deglobalization, and certainly I don't see decoupling on the horizon, except for certain areas such as maybe the splitternet, the internet, where, you know, the Chinese have already decoupled. I mean, this is the irony of many of this is that the policies that Trump the policies he is pursuing and his administration are pursuing are policies that the Chinese have already pursued. As I mentioned before, facing it in terms of reciprocity, I think would be a much better way of approaching it, and then negotiating with the Chinese. And actually, indeed, forcing them to open up. I mean, Facebook would love to get back into China. So I'm coming back to the internet, but it's one of the things on my mind.
Thank you. We have one from Ron Brown from UH Law School. How do you feel the growing number of free trade agreements by China, the European Union, and soon UK fit into your observations on globalism?
Thanks, Ron. Hi there. Haven't seen you in ages as well. This question is very simple to the one of development finance. I see a very similar pattern emerging with the spaghetti bowl of free trade agreements that we've already actually been undertaking for the last 20 years. The Doha round at the World Trade Organization has not been successful. So the WTO basically is stuck back in 1995, roughly. I feel American calls for reform are absolutely justified. The WTO needs reform, but not just by pulling out. There has to be a negotiation. It might ideally be, again, amongst China, the EU, and the United States to come to some kind of basic, you know, reform proposal, and then bring others on board. And bringing the Indians on board is always going to be very, very difficult. So what we end up with is with this spaghetti bowl of free trade agreements that are flowing one side or another. It still does look likely that the European Union and China will have a bilateral investment treaty that would strengthen their economic relationship fundamentally. It looks likely that China might do something with the UK, although I suspect the United States is going to move first. But let's face it, the United Kingdom is going to become a big player. It's not going to be a very important player globally. We see continued movements in Asia we have already the successor of the TTP, the CPTPP. If I said this correctly, I don't get this acronym evades me, as well as RCEP. But again, those also don't look, they're again too big, too multilateral. So it looks again likely that we are going to be falling back on this much more kind of neo-mercantilist, state-driven, bilateral, maybe quadrilateral arrangements where everybody then deals with each other. And I really would like to express this very strongly because I haven't. Other countries are not going to behave like in the Cold War. There is not the choice of becoming a satellite of the Soviet Union or of the United States. One doesn't have to. There's a much better choice there, which is let's hedge, let's play these powers off against each other. And I always point to Vietnam as a beautiful example. First, Vietnam has been a great beneficiary of the China-US trade war. It's been a great beneficiary of this kind of new phase of globalization because everybody wants to diversify and find an economy that functions somewhat or gives somewhat similar benefits as the Chinese economy does. But at the same time, Vietnam has become increasingly dependent on China in terms of trade, economics, and before COVID-19 tourism. So we see this again and again in so many examples. It's chaotic. Countries are hedging. They're playing the game. They're playing the big powers off against each other. And any one power that goes to one of these middle powers and says, you need to be on our side, might actually backfire. They might actually lose. So it's so different from the Cold War. Another, de-globalization, decoupling, Cold War, the new Cold War. Those are the three terms that are being kind of thrown around, bandied around, and each of them creates more misconceptions than actual understanding. Thanks.
Thank you. We have three more questions. Mark Schklov, what concerns do you have concerning military confrontations under these circumstances?
Well, here I'm an optimist for the simple reason that the great powers all possess nuclear weapons. And some of the emerging middle powers could do so quite rapidly. I mean, we know the Japanese, although it would go against the body politic, we just had, the anniversary of the dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but they could do so. So we had some very interesting reports that the Saudis are moving closer to enriching fuel or having the capacity to effectively enrich nuclear fuel, and that their efforts are being supported by the Chinese. We have the Iranians and so on. So nuclear weapons, if they're possessed by middle powers, could be really, really dangerous. We could get a regional nuclear war. I don't say this is an impossibility. The likelihood is very low, but it is a possibility. I would put it at, probably below 1%, or at least in the single digits. But nuclear war between the great powers, I think is almost impossible. I do feel that there's enough rationality left in humanity that we will avoid that. So then that means that all we're left with in terms of military conflict between the great powers is a local skirmish. And recent developments, especially between the US and China, show that both sides at least try to be careful, and especially the Chinese seem to be kind of pulled back. There were actually recent reports that Chinese lower ranked military officers, so captains of ships, etc., have been giving orders to avoid any conflict at any cost possible. So that kind of makes me more hopeful that we can avoid this. And I do feel that if we have a change in administration, somewhat calmer and rhetoric will, at least because actions have been actually quite rational and calm so far on the part of the administration, but especially in terms of rhetoric, that we get calmer rhetoric and that we get more communication, especially between the US and China, and that bodes well for at least avoiding military conflict. And conflict has moved to a different arena. It has moved into the arena of technology and economics. And there's a lot that nation states can do there. And I just saw another question on industrial policy, which comes back to one of the very simple arguments I would like to put out there, which is that if the United States wants to successfully compete with China, we not only can kind of cut the Chinese off, put in tariffs, ban Chinese apps, ban Chinese consulates, and so on. All of these measures are really half-baked. I agree with a lot of the basic analysis of the Trump administration vis-a-vis China, that there is a real challenge that we are facing. But to face that challenge, we need to learn again to do effective industrial policy. And it's not that we can't. We've got DARPA. DARPA works quite well. So, take DARPA and expand it by 100 times. Take the hundreds of billions that we're now spending on various things and put them into industrial policy. And Congress is talking about that, but I don't think Congress should be in charge, to be honest. This would have to be something that has to be done by a pilot agency that is somewhat encapsulated and distinct from political pressures, somewhat removed from political pressures. But it would be very difficult in the United States. I know I'm talking about perhaps doing the impossible here, but I do want to put this out as at least a point of debate. That is, how can the United States face the challenge of China, not so much by putting tariffs in place and restricting trade and interaction, more so by getting our own house in order and reinvigorating American manufacturing and innovation, which is actually doing really well. It just needs a push to keep competitive, to keep being competitive.
Thank you. And I think that was probably Terry Bogalki's question that you were referencing.
I think so,
We have
yes.
two more. We have two more, and we're almost up against 11 o'clock. Benjamin Lau, thank you for your analysis and insights, Christopher. Can you comment on the perceived challenges by many interests around the world, including G7 allies, on the US dollar as the world's reserve currency?
Okay, now comes the question that I can expound on for another hour.
Oh, no.
So I can
Yeah.
be with you for a long time, because that is what kind of almost half of my research is on.
Yeah.
Put short, I don't see any imminent danger to the dollar, but the telltale signs are there. The Trump administration use of the dollar, an increasingly creative use to put sanctions on people, is an expression of American power that actually is certainly a hell of a lot better than engaging in military action, but that also puts in place the incentives for others to seek an alternative currency mechanism. And both the Europeans and certainly the Chinese, as well as the Russians, even the Indians, even the Japanese, have been looking into this quite carefully. How can we have an international system that is more diversified? That doesn't mean abandoning the dollar. I actually don't see that happening at all. So if the dollar loses its preeminence, I would still see like 40% of global reserves in dollars, and the dollar being roughly 30% of foreign exchange, on one side, one or the other side of foreign exchange trades. So, but this diversification also means that other countries have to step up. And there's a very interesting article in Foreign Affairs recently that argued that it actually would be in the interest of the United States itself to abandon the dollar, because what it creates an overvalued currency for Americans, and that hurts our manufacturing. It though does help us in going into debt. We're facing very, very low interest rates. So it's a two-sided sword. And for other countries such as the European Union or China to provide an internationally liquid reserve currency does mean giving up certain things. It would mean a much more overvalued currency, something the Germans, who actually could deal with a much higher value of the euro, don't like at all. And it would be very bad for the Spaniards and for the Italians and the French. So we're in this kind of interesting, again, this chaotic transitional period where I strongly feel the dollar will begin to lose its preeminence. But what is the alternative? And who steps up to provide this alternative? And might it just be by default that we then end up with 3 different currencies, each of whom is quite systemically important, but each country still kind of controls this currency? And so, who knows? It's an absolutely fascinating question. But I do see that the three things together: the Trump administration's policies of using the dollar, the gradual decline of American economic importance globally. So this is something that is actually good for the globe, but that does mean we have roughly 20% of GDP, but we are the furnisher of the globe's reserve currency, and then also finally. Just the stepping up of other countries, and especially the European Union, to use their currency more internationally. So those three factors put together, I do see the dollar gradually losing its preeminence, but I'm not sure. It certainly won't swap from the dollar to the renminbi or to the euro, and it's also unlikely that the dollar will totally lose its preeminence and be replaced by a basket of currencies or something like that. So yeah.
So we'll wrap this up with
a complicated question.
We'll wrap this up with a final question from John Tasato. U.S. global economy, military global outreach, China catching up to U.S. What is the impact currently with COVID-19 and future relations? Oh wait, go ahead.
No, it's thanks, John. It's a very good question. At present, it does look like the countries that have gotten the virus under control effectively will be the ones that do best economically. So while China has been hit hard, its economy has really roared back. And this is especially the industrial side of the Chinese economy. As in so many other places, the consumption side of the Chinese economy is not doing so well, but still relatively to other countries actually doing quite well. The export figures and import figures of July very clearly express this. Exports are up by over 7%. As I said, they've reached the highest level for July ever for China. So Chinese exports are clearly doing well. Chinese imports are down. Again, this expresses how Chinese consumption has been relatively weak. Another economy like Taiwan, for example, has been doing really well because they are probably the most successful economy that has brought its pandemic under control. Europe looks to be doing better now, again, because COVID-19 is relatively under control. There's been a resurgence, but if you look at what the Germans are doing, I have actually quite great confidence in the German economy recovering. So the real outlier is the United States, and this will hurt us. It will hurt us economically. It will hurt off. Actually, this is my biggest fear: is that we'll have a drawn-out election that lasts right into January. But if we do get a clear-cut election and we get a different administration, that again could help someone. It doesn't really help bringing COVID-19 under control, because that's all my Chinese friends are saying with relation to the US is 没有中央. There is no center. There is no central governmental effort to get this thing under control. And in terms of testing, we surely need it. So,
thank you, Chris. Thank you for your presentation, for the questions. I think we all learned so much, and good to know that you're available to us, for future events. Thank you, and thank you everyone for tuning in today. I also want to thank the support staff who helped put this together. Dana, thank you for running the back end. Phyllis, Tabusa for also negotiating all of this. So again, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you soon.